Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today a wonderful little book by an American writer, Nicholson Baker, a book from 1991 called You and I. Now, You and I is a pretty special book, as we'll see in a second, very special in fact. But perhaps before that we can say a word or two about Nicholson Baker. He is an American writer. And he shot to fame a little bit in 1988 with a book called The Mezzanine. And then the Room Temperature book came in 1990. And those two books are pretty remarkable. They are reminiscent a little bit of the French school of the 1960s, 70s, 80s called Le Nouveau Roman, the new novel. And they're special in that the main narrator, the narrator of the book, is actually describing everything that goes through his head over a span of time of perhaps 10 minutes or 5 minutes. That is the time it takes him to lace his shoe. So much is going through his mind, as it is going through all our minds, that of course it gives a very different, unique shape to the novel. And after that, Baker wrote La Fermata. Fermata is from, 92, 93 perhaps, which is an erotic novel playing with the theme of time and desire. Very interesting. And Nicholson Baker also wrote a lot of non-fiction, or quite a lot of non-fiction, three of which I really like. The Way the World Works, a series of essays. Human Smoke, a work of history. Basically presenting the Second World War through writing which is not Baker's own writing. So Baker hardly comments, he gives a source. Sometimes he says a couple of words about something, he explains something that is not clear perhaps, but for the rest he simply lets the documents, the official documents, the semi-official documents speak, and he organized them in such a way that he does give an argument to his book. Human Smoke, absolutely wonderful book from 2008. And in 2016, as an experiment, I guess, a social, perhaps, experiment, Nicholson Baker became a substitute teacher for, I think, about a year. He was being sent out to schools wherever he lives in America. I can't remember, I think a central state somewhere. And he experienced the life of, a substitute teacher in kind of semi-rural schools in America. An extremely interesting book for the picture it gives of what happens at American schools in terms of learning, in terms of transmitting knowledge and skills. Highly recommended. Now, today, You and I, a 1991 book by Nicholson Baker. And remember, of course, if you do like this video, subscribe, like, and the like. Now, what is special about You and I? Well, You and I is spelled You, like the letter, and I, like the letter. And it is a play on word, obviously, you, Y-O-U, the pronoun you, but it is also the first letter of the name of John Updike. Now, John Updike was an extremely important literary figure in America in the second half of the 20th century. He remains a very, very big name, and one of his books from the 60s, one of a trilogy called Rabbit Run, the first one, is still, I think, a book which is very much studied in schools and universities, probably. And John Updike wrote an enormous amount, not only of novels, but also of short stories and non-fiction essays in general. Now, what is original about You and I by Nicholson Baker is that it focuses on the relationship between Nicholson Baker, the writer, and John Updike, somebody he met, I think, just once or twice perhaps, and it didn't go very well. In other words, he didn't know John Updike personally, and they had no real professional relationship either. Now, one day, Nicholson Baker is commissioned or asked whether he wants to write a piece for a magazine on John Updike. And in the beginning, Baker tells us that he is a little bit hesitant because he doesn't feel that he knows so much about Updike, nor does he feel that he's perhaps the best person to do so, to write about John Updike. Nevertheless, he starts thinking about it as an experiment, and he tells us all this in the beginning of You and I. It's a very engaging text. Nicholson Baker has a very light touch, very ironic touch as well. And remember, in 1991, Nicholson Baker was still in his 20s, was very young. So what he does basically is that he starts writing about the work of John Updike, which I remind you is kind of massive, on the basis of his memory. That is, he decides, tongue-in-cheek perhaps, but he decides not to reread Updike before writing about him. In other words, he wants to write on the basis of what he remembers as a reader of John Updike. Now, so far so good, you would say, yeah, that's not unknown and there's nothing original about this, really. Well, no, but what is original is that Nicholson Baker first writes the manuscript of this book, in a way, based on his memories of John Updike. Then, what he does, which is original, is that he goes back to check whether what he remembered, what he wrote about, is actually to be found in the work of John Updike. And then, and what is really very original about You and I, is that he goes back to the manuscript of his own work, Nicholson Baker, armed this time with having checked John Updike's work, and he basically annotates his own work, comparing what he remembered and he first wrote about and what he actually checked and is the reality in the work of John Updike. So, obviously, you can imagine that he gets a lot of it wrong. Now, we always have in our head perhaps the idea of those great literary figures able to recite poetry at the drop of a hat and who know all the quotes from all the books from all the writers. But what actually is interesting in You and I by Nicholson Baker, what is interesting is the relationship we have with that memory, and the reality of that memory perhaps become secondary. So it's an investigation, it's not really an investigation into what we remember about memory as a concept or as a construct. It is really an investigation into the relationship between the reader and what has fed him or her in his or her readings throughout their life. So the question of whether it matters if Nicholson Baker remembers everything or whether he gets his wrong is only interesting in what it tells us about the relationships that we create throughout our lives with the texts that meant something to us, or perhaps didn't mean that much, or touched us on one level but not on others. You know, those books we remember, we half remember something about, perhaps just a line or a description, and then we go back, we check, and actually that thing is not at all to be found in the book. We took it from somewhere else, or we created it ourselves, or we amalgamated 2, 3, 4 different sources in order to create one quote. All those things, of course, as readers, we know very well, we go through. And that is what is fantastic about You and I, is that Nicholson Baker investigates, not in a pretentious sort of fake academic way at all. No, it remains very light, very funny. But it does investigate what it actually means to engage with the work over years and what is left of it. So it's a homage paid to Updike in his feeding function of Baker's development as a writer, but it is not about Updike so much again as Baker's relationship with Updike as a writer, as an author, as a figure, as a literary canon or canonical figure. I think this book is extremely original in its approach to the subject. It is also original in its rewriting of itself again. Nevertheless, reading this, one could be reminded of a couple of fantastic works that take a sort of not similar approach really, but a similar concern, show a similar concern for the role of memory and the blurring of fiction, non-fiction in many ways. Michael Ondaatje, an absolutely wonderful book, a fantastic little book, very thin, on a jazz, Buddy Bolden, a jazz player, from before the era of New Orleans jazz, so at the very tail end of the 19th century. A fantastic book. Hardly anything is known about Bolden. There's one photograph, and it's not even certain that it is him. And yet Michael Ondaatje manages to recreate something from the memories of other people around him, who by the time he wrote the book were long dead, but also by recreating from his own memories of the music, of the atmosphere, trying to recreate a life. It is not a biography, it is an invented biography, and at the same time it feels much bigger than the simple life of somebody. Geoff Dyer, the wonderful English writer, did something similar in his very little but beautiful, absolutely wonderful book about jazz. If you have no interest in jazz music, it makes absolutely no difference, because he tries to sort of recreate a character from very famous jazz figures from mostly the 40s, 50s. And he's not trying to recreate their lives exactly, nor give real indication about the biography. It is a blurring again of fiction, non-fiction. It is about Dyer, it is about the jazz man, and it is about their relationship in many ways. Dyer, in fact, the same thing in his book on D.H. Lawrence, Out of Sheer Rage. Wonderful book, extremely funny. And it is nominally on D.H. Lawrence, but it is just as much on the reader of D.H. Lawrence, who Geoff Dyer is. And therefore, again, it is about the relationship between a reader and what remains of what is read in a certain type of work or certain corpus of works. Now, of course, one could say that the main interest here, when it comes to us readers and you and I, is to ask ourselves the same type of question, that is, what do we remember of what we read? And of course, we know that we remember impressions more than facts or sentences, unless we have, of course, a great memory or we write those chunks down. And as time passes, of course, those memories blend into other memories of similar text, perhaps, or text with the same flavor or the same themes or the same writing style or the same period. And sometimes it becomes difficult to know where what you remember comes from. But of course, the point here of Nicholson Baker in You and I is to explore how all those half-remembered or perhaps not remembered and completely invented memories we carry in us builds us. All this makes us who we eventually become, of course. And so it is not so much about the exactitude of your memories, nor is it about your learning by heart thousands of lines from the great authors. It is much more about establishing relationships between those memories and all the rest of what you remember in terms of reading, so that a book that you read 10 years ago can certainly be brought back to your memory by reading another book today. It may be very different, but there might be enough of a connection for you to certainly bring those two together. That is what the French academic Pierre Bayard wrote about already a while ago. A wonderful, wonderful, very small book, which is called How to Talk About Books When You Have Not Read Them. And he's a literature specialist. And nevertheless, he realizes, of course, that a lot of what he's supposed to have read in his position, he has not read. And a lot of what he did read, he cannot remember at all. He makes a list in the beginning of the book. It's hilarious. It's also painful for us who love to read to remember that, of course, if we remember 1% of what we read, we should be very, very lucky, I think. But Bayard's point, of course, it is very serious. That is, how can one talk about things that one has not read? Well, you can talk about it because you know enough about reading, about literature in general, and you can start making connections and knowing that when somebody comes from that place at that time and he or she is related to those people, then there is a good chance that you can talk about them, that is, you can talk about them as exemplars of a period, of a movement, etc. There's a very funny short story by Lennon, let me check, Robert Lennon, an American writer as well. I'll put it on screen. I hope it's okay. You can pause, of course, and read it. And this is the same. There's an entry in Alan Bennett, the playwright, the English playwright, in his journals as well, where he recounts seeing a passage in a book he bought secondhand, and there was a passage underlined, and he reads that passage because he thinks it must mean something important. It must have meant something important to the one who read it before me. He finds the passage, bland and not very significant. And he suddenly realizes, of course, that it was not somebody who had underlined the passage. It was just a hair put in the wrong place in the book. Now, this again reminds us that we do identify passages in books, sentences, one-liners, descriptions, profound aphorisms. We do find those when we read. We do annotate very often those books. Make a mark in a margin perhaps, or a page reference in the interior of the book. And those we progressively forget. We forget that we ever read this or that text, but we don't entirely forget, of course, and this accumulation of readings feeds us, makes us, of course, the readers we eventually become. That is, somebody we can read much more quickly. I don't mean technically quickly, of course. I just mean simply that our entry to interpretation is, of course, facilitated by the amount of reading we've done. There's, in fact, a wonderful little passage, quotation by Geoff Dyer again. I'll put it on screen, basically saying that yes, it doesn't really matter what you read in the beginning when you're young. What matters is that you do read. It doesn't matter that you forget what you've read, because those things slowly accumulate without you actually being aware of them. And it is those bit by bit growing memories of texts, half memories, blurry memories. It is all of them which basically, interrelating at some stage, will start to create a much bigger picture of what reading is, what books are, what literature has been and is. And therefore it becomes a lot easier to start anchoring new texts in a context that you've built over your own life as a reader. So that is one offshoot theme in You and I think, for me as a reader, certainly, that is also how I read that book. I relate it to my own experience. But if your experience is slightly different from mine, if you have read less or more or something different, your age is different as well, it might be that, of course, this book resonates with you in a different way. It might be the style, it might be the very, very funny writing of Nicholson Baker. It might be about Updike and the relationship that one grows into with a writer one admires. It might be about Baker himself as a developing, budding writer at the time. Nevertheless, whichever aspect of this has a chance of resonating with you, I think you should really seize it. It's a wonderful book. It is a short book, but it contains multitudes, as another American would have said, and I can only heartily recommend it. Bye.